Okay, yesterday we examined the stark difference between the American War of Independence, which produced freedom from tyranny, and the grotesque French Revolution, which created a new kind of slavery to tyranny. In short, the French Revolution was a violent political insurrection to illegally overthrow a legitimate government and to force a lawless, unconstitutional government in its place. The American War for Independence, remember, was a legal conflict to establish a lawful government in place of a lawless government. So in the French Revolution, a few determined rebels exploited wild and frenzied mobs with the politics of destruction. The mob became a powerful tool for political gang lords, which finally began, after they got power, to devour each other. And we saw the same thing happen just this month in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone of Seattle. At Chaz, the mob got what it wanted: total autonomy in a place of no governance, no law, no order, no rules, no authority, total autonomy to make chaos. Observers with no historical or moral perspective were looking at it, and they thought it was a perfect democratic utopia, a place of free love, they described it. No work, no responsibility, a never-ending block party. The food and drink somehow were expected to materialize from enthralled donors, people who were just enamored of what was going on and what these people were doing. Peace and order somehow were supposed to just happen spontaneously. But instead, the weak were exploited. Women and children were sexually assaulted or killed. And so what do we learn from this? When people try to live together, public order is absolutely necessary. Some kind of social cohesion is necessary. And it's not easy to arrange this. It's not easy to achieve this. Cheap slogans are no substitute for real law and justice. That East Precinct in the Chaz Zone, that police precinct, it was in fact not a symbol of white supremacy, as they were shouting and calling it. It was actually started in the 1980s by a black councilman who knew that black families in the area were demanding more police protection, not less. Sam Smith was his name, and he saw police protection as a public service. That is not how it's being seen today by the young white social justice warriors who think they know better and how to run a society by getting rid of social order. They are the ones who helped invade and shut down and burn the East Precinct. And what happened as a result? Young black men died as a result of it. So Chaz was not a utopia. In the absence of a legitimate police force, armed criminal gangs started roaming around. Untrained anarchist paramilitaries filled the void in the Chaz to become the dominant legitimate powers, and they were beginning to quarrel with each other and would have devoured each other, and some of them actually began to do that. In the end, what happened? The mayor ordered the police to come in, and the per capita murder rate in that place, by the end, when it was cleaned out by the police, was nearly 50 times greater than Chicago's, said the police chief. He said that the area has become lawless and brutal. 4 shootings, 2 fatal, robberies, assaults, countless property crimes have occurred in this several block area, is what he said. Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best. The same thing can happen with entire nations, as France proved, and in all Marxist nations have proved. You destroy the order that's been built over years, decades, or centuries, like it has been in Western Europe. And what happens? The nations become just as chaotic. But the mob got what it wanted in France, and then power and freedom from all moral justice and laws, just like in Chaz. And before it was over, and some semblance of law and order was returned to France, that self-righteous mob murdered, and I gave you these stats yesterday, but I'll repeat them again, murdered over 40,000 French citizens on the guillotine. More than 350,000 Parisians were rounded up by the mobs, thrown into jail, and they spent time in jail, lots of time in these horrible, filthy jails for being politically incorrect, being suspected of being enemies of the revolution. An estimated 300,000 were murdered by a firing squad, but they don't even know. They couldn't keep the records. They have no idea how many they killed and murdered. Now, let's ask this question. Why so much death? When you get a situation like this, you get a revolution, why so much death? Well, there are several reasons. Most of the Frenchmen at the time knew that a revolutionary utopia would not work, and they did not support the revolution. Many were killed because they simply would not join the destructive mobs. And here's another reason to look at. The revolutionaries, they had no plan for governing a complex society once they had gotten their power, once they had destroyed all civility and law and order. They didn't know what they were going to do. So the obvious management solution to a situation like this, if you're in power and it's a whole nation or a whole city and you don't know what to do, genocide can be your answer. More and more genocide. And so the hateful revolutionary leaders were so unruly and immoral to govern themselves. They couldn't even govern themselves. They couldn't govern the people. And they would neither admit the truth to know what to do or how to come up with a plan. They simply started killing the citizens until the population was a manageable size and their utopia could be realized. Robespierre argued that the population of 28 million Frenchmen would need to be reduced through government murder to 2 million, from 28 million down to 2 million. That was his plan, and he said 2 million would be more than enough Frenchmen for us to have. The other leaders argued about the number to kill and ultimately agreed to a final official figure of 20 million. Okay, so can you imagine this? These leaders are arguing about how many we're going to kill. 60 million, 20 million, 26 million, like Robespierre wanted. They settled on 20 million. 8 million would be permitted to live by the government, and all the rest would be killed through government programs. So to begin the genocide, the government, creative idea, release all the most violent pathological criminals in the prisons to begin and advance the terror and the depopulation effort. That's what they did in France. But this is not all the organizers of the revolution wanted. Get this. They intended, with that 8 million that would be left, to debauch and corrupt those who survived, so that there would be no moral counter-revolution, because the people, the survivors, the remains of those people, would be so corrupt, wouldn't know how to stand up against a corrupt government. And so here's what the government did. They ordered the elitist media industry to endorse the chaos of the revolution as a good thing, and then to popularize debauchery. Historian Otto Scott wrote that for the first time since the decadent days of Rome, pornography emerged and circulated openly in a once civilized nation. Perversion became not only acceptable but fashionable in France. And then new religious cults appeared, which was fine as long as they were not Christian, and the chaos was leveraged to reconstruct every single traditional French, every institution of French society, like marriage and the family and the identity of the people. The goal was to make them progressively more comfortable with the moral chaos of relativism, and they were succeeding. Okay, and it's still a problem in France. And as it progressed, Edmund Burke continued to try to analyze what was going on and observe what was going on from his position in the United Kingdom. Edmund Burke said that the revolution was turning the people into a nation of gross, stupid, ferocious, and at the same time poor and sordid barbarians, destitute of religion, honor, or manly pride, possessing nothing at present and hoping for nothing hereafter. Possessing nothing at present and hoping for nothing hereafter. That's the end of his quote. And so a people without hope can be easily controlled in the present. So is this why America's revolutionaries are now calling for John Lennon's Imagine song to be the new national anthem, celebrating the wish that there's no hereafter, no heaven above us, no hell below us? What does drive the current revolutionary trends in America? That's the question we need to be digging into and diving into now. Most of the more fashionable groups are quite upfront on their websites about the strategies of Marxist-Leninist revolution which drive them. They just print it right out there. print quotes from Marx from the Communist Manifesto. Now that word is out that BLM is a Marxist organization, it's not just a good, clean organization with a slogan that happens to be true. Of course Black Lives Matter, and that's true. But what is true now about the organization that's building this? It's only exploiting black participants and naive corporations which cannot distinguish between a true statement that Black Lives Matter and a subversive organization. Now, the good news is that many corporations and governments and donors are beginning to distance themselves from the BLM organization, not from the cause of reforming, all the corruption in police departments, which does exist, and reforming social problems in different nations. Those have to be addressed. But they're distancing themselves from the organization, which states its intention to do what? Abolish the nuclear family, abolish police and prisons, abolish heteronormativity, and abolish capitalism, because they say it's racist, and they want to replace the entire capitalist system and our free market economy with communism. They talk about this right on their site. They talk about this in their meetings. They talk about this as they gather the comrades together to get them all on the same page. And they're expected to be all on the same page. So here's the history which is coming out. And this is really interesting. Eric Mann, the former domestic terrorist, the old white Marxist from the Weather Underground, trained BLM founders Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza, who publicly admit now that they are trained Marxists, super versed in ideological theories, they've said. And here is one of the main theories of the Marxist followers, and this has been true since the middle 1800s. Exploit people for the revolution. Hijack the issues for the sake of the revolution. Hijack people for the sake of the revolution. The revolution is really all that matters. Here's an example. Going back to the 1960s, when Marxism was really beginning to put roots down in this country, in almost every aspect of society, from the media to the universities. It was a long march through the institutions, and they were putting roots down everywhere. So here's the example. Let's say boys are being sent to the Vietnam War. That's an issue that we can exploit, we can hijack. And so we can agitate for their freedom by starting riots and shootouts. But remember, we don't really care about the boys. We only care about the revolution. And that's one of the ideological principles behind the revolution that every revolutionary has to learn. You exploit the issue, but you can't get hung up on the issue. It's all about the revolution. It's always all about the revolution. Another example is the Black Panther movement. It was exploited by old white Marxists, and this was also in the 60s, who didn't care about civil rights for blacks, but they did care about bloody revolution, which put fear and chaos into the neighborhoods when ambushes were set for policemen. And policemen were killed. Yes, there were many fatal ambushes. Then there was the Occupy Wall Street movement recently about how the 1% of the bankers are stealing wealth from the 99% of all the rest of us poor people. And the revolutionaries have never cared about the poor. But they do care about the revolution to destabilize and ridicule and intimidate Wall Street and to bring it down. And in the process, they recruited thousands of very well-off white kids who just wanted to divest themselves of their richness by joining in the riots so that they could, identify with revolutionary politics. So who was it? Okay, thinking back on this, the divesting of your previous identity to get a new one so that you're not part of the oppressor. The oppressors, you're part of, the oppressed, and you're working with them and fighting with them, no matter what your upbringing might have been. So who was it who made the racist statement that said, white youth must choose sides now. They must either fight on the side of the oppressed or be on the side of the oppressor. And that's what they have to decide. Well, here's who said it. Take a look at this old pollster. It was this revolutionary Marxist who was calling for the overthrow of the United States government. She's the colleague of that Marxist guy who trained the BLM leaders. She's the girl who married the Marxist domestic terrorist who exploited a young black politician named Barack Obama in Chicago. She and her husband are now celebrated professional leftists in the Chicago aristocracy. And I used to see her on this poster. When I was a boy going into the post office, she was wanted for crimes of bombing with the Weather Underground. And they were the people who blew up society, blew up the statue of the heroic policeman in Chicago, because they were all well versed in the ideological theories, like exploiting people for the revolution. And that's what they've been doing since I was a kid. Now they had the Weather Underground had this four-fingered salute that they would use with each other. It represented a fork, because there was a fork used by Tex Watson to stab Sharon Tate, murdering her and her unborn baby in the Charles Manson murders back in the 1960s. And that's where they get this. Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times before she died. And the Weather Underground believed that white babies had to die because they had what they called skin privilege. They didn't call it white privilege then, they called it skin privilege. And that all representatives of imperialism and oppressors are oppressors. And unless you side with the oppressed, you've got to die. And so this young kid who was exploited and recruited into the revolutionary movement, Tex Watson, was just another one who was exploited for this purpose. They didn't care about him, but he was cannon fodder. He was used in the battle. He was used for death and murder. I actually spent several hours with this guy, Tex Watson, interviewing him inside his maximum security prison in 1977 about what had happened, what he did, how he was persuaded to commit these revolutionary acts like murder. And here's what he told me. He was made to feel guilty about his association with the system that needed to come down, with civilization. He was persuaded that he could bring in a new world by inciting violence, even inciting race war, some kind of conflict which would change history. And again, this is the Marxist view of history. This was Karl Marx's view of history. This was the French view of history in the late 1700s. And so all Marxist groups, and we really have to understand this, they're good at doing this kind of ridicule and shaming. And my public school was actually good at doing this to me, ridiculing and bullying those who might still have bourgeois individualism or who didn't agree with the party line. And they were forcing us to, come to the acknowledgement that we were deep down, we were really bourgeois civilizationalists, which was wrong. We weren't part of the revolution. And were trying to make us feel really guilty that we had this background, we had this legacy, we had this inheritance. It was somehow in us, and we needed to get rid of it and divest ourselves of it by cleansing ourselves, by being part of the revolution. That's what Tex Watson really felt. Race really hasn't been that much of an issue for a very long time. When people talk about whiteness and blackness, these are merely terms being used right now to signify one's loyalty to the revolution. And this is why revolutionaries are saying Thomas Sowell and Candace Owens and Carol Swain are not black. And this is why sorority girls, white sorority girls, are now so ashamed to be called white. And they're telling them that whiteness is no longer politically acceptable. It's only the revolution that matters. And so to revolutionaries, here's what they want. Okay. Let's get right down to their definition of it. And what do the mobs want? What do the revolutionaries really want? Well, we can see from their writings in history, they want the total destruction of law and order. They want the total destruction of Western law and order, especially Western, and any institution that once supported it. And so that means they need and want the total destruction of family and marriage and Christianity, common law, independent courts, independent business, personal character, ideas of honor, and concepts of civility. Now, that's one thing that has really interested me. They want the very concepts of virtue to be gotten rid of. Honor and civility, that all has to go. They also demand immunity from the last existing laws. We're revolutionaries. We're heroic. You need to treat us special, give us special consideration. We need immunity from the last existing laws because we need to break a whole lot of laws to break the system and tear it down. They want the cancellation of all personal obligations like loans and rent and mortgages and things like that. That's what the mob wants. And so the mob today follows trained revolutionary Marxists. And it's time for the culture to recognize that revolutions destroy entire nations. Not just a little 6-block area in Seattle. Revolutionaries and revolutions can destroy entire nations. It's time to stop giving the lawless what they demand and do what the founders did. I told you that I would tell you what Sam Adams said after the signers signed the Declaration of Independence and all was quiet in the hall. Let me read his quote. "We have this day restored the sovereign, to whom alone all men ought to be obedient." And what he's talking about, he's talking about restoring God, because what has been going on with the British, King George has been acting like he's God and like he's the sovereign. There's no law higher than he, and that he can make whatever law he wants and force it on the colonists to their detriment. And so it's as though King George and the Parliament are pulling God down from his throne, so he's no longer there. And so what Sam Adams is saying, if we have restored the sovereign, to whom alone all men ought to be obedient, not to Parliament, not to King George, to whom alone. He reigns in heaven, and with a propitious eye beholds his subjects, assuming that freedom of thought and dignity of self-direction which he bestowed on them. From the rising to the setting sun may his kingdom come. And that's Sam Adams, and that's how the founders saw things. And they were really serious about what they were doing. They knew what the essence of revolution meant, which really is what we can see from these revolutionary movements, which go back, farther than Greece and Rome. But French really perfected the modern version of it. And it really is trying to take what was built up really from the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries and forward, virtue and civilization in these Western nations, including now Canada and the United States and Australia, New Zealand, etc., and trying to tear it down. The foundation of which was the respect and reverence for God Almighty. So let me close out here. The founders understood they were restoring God to his rightful place as ruler of history and ruler of the nations. It's really that simple. Revolutionaries don't get to rule.
To connect with us directly, please visit geoffreybotkin.com and send any questions or thoughts that you might have to questions@geoffreybotkin.com.